This is the Crime Cafe, your podcasting source of great crime, suspense, and thriller writing. I'm your host, Debbi Mack. Before I bring on my guest, I'll just remind you that the Crime Cafe has 2 ebooks for sale, the 9-book box set and the short story anthology. You can find the buy links for both on my website, debbimack.com, DEBBIMACK.com, under the Crime Cafe link. You can also get a free copy of either book if you become a Patreon supporter. You'll get that and much more if you support the podcast on Patreon, along with our eternal gratitude for doing so. I'm pleased to have on the show today the author of The German Messenger, David Malcolm. Thanks for being here with me today, David. Great to have you on.
It's a pleasure.
And I've started.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad you're able to be here. I started your novel, and it pulled me right in with its combined historical detail and espionage angle. Tell us about the book and what inspired you to write it.
The novel's a historical espionage fiction. It's set in late 1916, early 1917, in the middle of the Great War. The protagonist and the narrator tells his own story. There's a guy called Harry Draffen, who is, as I put it in the blurb on the back cover, a polyglot cosmopolitan man of violence. He's a British agent. He's a British secret agent. And he's having a fairly vile war, as indeed a lot of people did. And he is asked at a certain point by his chief to start to try to unravel what they think, what his intelligence superiors think is a German, Austrian Central Powers plot against Britain. Of course, the whole point is they're not very sure what it is. He's not very sure what it is. And so he spends much of the novel trying to work out what exactly is going on. And he eventually works out there is a German messenger who is a key figure. And that's the figure he has to pursue. And he does so actually mostly in Britain, although there's lots of retrospects, there's lots of going back to Europe mostly before the war and in the early years of the war. But it largely takes place in Britain, and he tries to work out what's going on. He tries to unravel the conspiracy, and it all. I'm obviously not going to tell you exactly what happened.
No spoilers.
No, I wouldn't do that. But it turns out to be, of course, as always in such novels, fiendishly complicated. To be perfectly frank, I'm not entirely sure I can remember all the twists and turns. But and of course, obviously, it turns out not quite to be what he thought it was, or what anybody thought it was. And it all comes to a fairly unhappy, really quite how to put it, I hope surprising and shocking conclusion.
I was going to say noirish.
Oh God! Well, I mean, obviously, in a sense, it's not noir because it's the wrong period and it's not set in California. But I have to say that over the years, increasingly, I'm aware of this, that noir films and really noir writing, finally, like classic stuff like Chandler and Ross MacDonald, but also particularly movies like Double Indemnity, like Alan Ladd, Veronica Lake, Jane Greer movies, Robert Mitchum movies from the late 40s and the 50s. I'm afraid they've sort of colonized my brain So I tend to either explicitly or by by references, just by atmosphere. I tend to draw on the noir the noir atmosphere, the noir darkness, as it were.
Yes, I was going to say I was reading a review in Crime Fiction Lover of the novel, and it said if it were filmed, it would be done essentially like a film noir. So, is that the way you imagine a film adaptation of the book would be?
Believe me, my phone is always on. I'm waiting for the coast to call. I know somebody who knows somebody to whom that happened, and I think Hollywood actually phoned up and said, "Ah, we looked to see your novel. We'd like to make a movie out of it."
Oh my gosh.
It is the coast calling you.
No, the coast never calls me. Or if it is the coast, it's the wrong coast.
Absolutely.
In any case,
But yes, the novel is hugely filmable. Whether it's filmable in terms of, for example, what used to be called a television special, a television series, although now you can't tell the difference between the quality of work and basically what you see, what British and American filmmakers make for TV now are really just long films broken into episodes. But it's either that or a traditional you could probably make it for about 1.5 2 hour movie, probably a 2 hour movie. And as I say, I wish somebody would.
So, but it sounds like those films do influence you, and certainly a lot of
those very much.
A lot of those movies were based on books. So
absolutely, James M. Cain is a great writer, and people could make very, very good movies out of his novels. I absolutely agree.
And it's not just limited to American fiction. There was Graham Greene.
Oh yeah.
Other writers.
Very, very filmable movies. Very, very filmable movies. Brighton Rock, The Heart of the Matter. Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see. Do you do a lot of historical research before you write your books? And how do you handle research in general? Is it before you write the book or throughout the writing?
Well, I mean, there's actually only one possible answer to that, which is, of course, I do masses of historical research.
I was going to say.
You do. Obviously, as I'm sure you know, a writer invents, and sometimes the best things you do, you invent. But I think there's a kind of, at a certain level, there's a kind of moral duty to the past. If you're going to write about the past, you want to try and get it more or less right, okay? And not only that, but if you've done some research, even if it's relatively superficial, you've actually looked at what streets looked like in Paris in 1903, or what the streets of London looked like, what buildings looked like, what kind of clubs were open in 1914, how people were dressed. You might not use any of that directly, I think, in the text, but it gives you a certain confidence. You, as it were, know what more or less what the characters looked like. And also, I think if you're very often historical fiction, and almost historical fiction, but very often historical crime fiction is set in really quite tense and complex historical periods. So, you need to know what kind of world your characters are moving through, and so you have to do some research. Now, obviously, I'm not a historian. I'm not a historian of the Great War, of the First War, but you try to understand what might have been going on. Although the story in the German Messenger is completely, I think it's probable, but in fact it's completely invented.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like at least getting that research done, a little of that ahead of time is probably a good idea, as opposed to just, that puts you in your characters' heads a little bit better. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. My father was a history teacher. Both my grandfathers were in the Great War. My father was in the Second War. So, I've always lived with a lot of history. And what I did with the German Messenger is I wrote out some of my concerns, some of my interests in that time. I did some research to you have to have a sense of what was going on in 1916. And it's the little things that you need to know that you often don't know. How long were women's dresses at various kinds of social occasions in London in late 1916? If you were in the army, did you wear your uniform to the party, or did you put on civilian clothes? Things like that. It might never come up in the text, although something like that might. But you need to know that. You need to know that. If a French officer appears, what's his uniform going to look like?
Exactly. Yeah, I was thinking, from my own perspective, the way I see it, a lot of times I'll do research ahead of time simply to get a sense of the world that character is in. And if something comes up as I'm writing, I'll just say, I really don't know enough about this. I need to look into it.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think I would agree with you very much. I think sensible writers like yourself.
I'd like to think so.
Yes, of course you do that. You need to know your world.
One of the things that fascinates me about spy novels is the moral ambiguity aspect of it. How do you create a protagonist who does things that might be considered almost anti-hero-like and make them likable?
Oh well, that's very. The end of that question is very interesting. Can I come to that later?
Sure.
First of all, I think the first point. I think espionage fiction appeals to many people, and it certainly appeals to me because it is precisely about the kinds of things that you run into in the wider world, in your own private world, where you work, which is basically people lie, people pretend to be who they aren't, people have agendas that they are hiding, and you see deceit, you see lies, you see corruption all around you, and that is what particularly espionage fiction, serious, or really actually almost all 20th century espionage fiction, but serious espionage fiction, that's what it's about. And it's about the ambiguities, also the ambiguities of not knowing who you're dealing with, where you are, whom you can trust, and not sometimes quite knowing who you are. Now, if you come to the second point, which has to do with the characters who do all sorts of evil things and are yet likable, I have to say responses to the central character of the German Messenger have been very mixed. Two of my very good friends, who are very astute readers of fiction, have said, more or less, I think the guy's a schmuck. He's a total schmuck. And I said, well, I think he does some bad things. I'm not sure I would quite agree with that. And other people have said, he's a very damaged, very, very tormented figure, which is, I suppose, what he would be. I don't know if I like him or not. and you know this yourself when you write, the characters to some extent start to take over. They start to do things. Now, obviously, we all know this. We could stop them doing it. We could decide that they do not turn right around that corner, they go left. But they sometimes, it seems like, it's an illusion, but it seems like they develop a will of their own. And I found Draffen doing things and being somebody that quite surprised me, and I just let it go. Whether it worked or not, I don't know. He presented himself to me. That's all I can say, and he seemed to be the person there involved in that story and the center of things. And he also was a voice that I heard and that I found interesting. So that would be my sort of answer to your question. I didn't expect the second bit, but some people I know who've read the book have said that he's just an awful man. And I think he is an awful man, and I think he has good reason to be an awful man. And he knows he's an awful man.
But the funny thing is, there are many times when you see awful men or awful people portrayed as the protagonist and find us rooting for them. I'll use the example of, say, the Sopranos or the Americans.
Oh yes. Tony Soprano is a very bad man.
He's a very bad man, and yet we sympathize at some level with him. We find the humanity in him somehow. Yes, the fact that he loves horses or his family or something.
Yes.
So there's always something there, that connects.
No, I agree very much, and yes, that is certainly something that belongs. Well, it's as old as stories, isn't it? It's as old as all kinds of stories. The figures in the Trojan narratives, like Homer's narratives, they just do some unspeakable things, are just really annoying and vile human beings. But yet there's an interest in them. There's a complexity. So I completely agree with you.
So what writers have most inspired your work? Are you inspired by the other espionage authors like Le Carre, for instance?
Well, it would be very hard not to be. Mr. Le Carre is a very fine writer, and other British espionage writers too, like Len Deighton. I think I think Len Deighton is also a very, very fine writer. And I've also, I suppose, read quite widely in later both historical espionage fiction and espionage fiction, or increasingly now crime fiction set in the modern period. The espionage tradition, obviously, in British literature goes back to Conrad and goes back to John Buchan. And actually, both of those were in my mind much more than Le Carre when I wrote The German Messenger. Conrad's The Secret Agent and Buchan's 39 Steps, the 39 Steps. Both of those are very, very strong references in the novel. Almost too much, I think, at times, but it works, I hope.
Wow, it's been a long time since I've read The Secret Agent, and now I want to read it again.
Oh, no. I mean, Conrad is one of the greatest writers in many different genres and very different kinds of fiction. He's one of the greatest writers in English. And The Secret Agent, for my money, is his best novel. I am very, very impressed.
Wow.
I hope you go back to it.
Yeah, I do want to. Wow, you've got me all excited to read that again.
He invents noir before anybody else. He does noir before anybody else.
And the 39 Steps, I've never read the book, but I've seen the movie.
I mean, Hitchcock's film version, and there's various other film versions. They're all very fine. The novel itself is much better than you think it would be. I mean, I've got a great sympathy for Buchan because he was Scottish and very very obviously so. In his work, he's actually much better writer. At least I would argue, and a number of other people would argue, he's much better writer than he's given credit for being. The 39 Steps is just a great novel. I mean, there are massive improbabilities and melodramatic bits in it, but no, he's a lot more complicated than people think he is. Now, the 39 Steps is quite important for the German Messenger, because the German Messenger is a reworking of the 39 Steps. I don't want it to make it sound literary, but that's what it is. That's what it is. It's a reworking of that.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you for describing it that way. I mean, it just, now I have a whole all new books to add to my reading list again, to reread and to etc. So what are you working on now?
Yes, when I have time.
Uh-huh.
What I'm working on is is a novel which is made up of a series of adventures of a character who is in many ways quite the opposite of Draffen. He's a German officer from the First World War. He's called Alexander Stegemann, and he's actually an academic who to a certain extent really just wants to get back to his books. He wants to get back to the library, or any old library. But I take up stories with him, which I've started to link together into a novel after 1918, and it follows him through the 20s on into the early 30s, and with all kinds of complex encounters, particularly with the English, because he's half Scottish. His mother was Scottish, his father was German, and so he again, like Draffen, is a complicated figure who's torn in different directions.
They're the best kind.
Well, you don't have to work hard to produce conflicts, do you? But I think he's a very interesting figure, and the stories he's involved in, the episodes he's involved in, I think are quite complicated, quite complex, but yet I hope interesting, and with a bit of luck, I hope they've finished. I thought I had finished, but I haven't. I hope to have finished a novel set in the 1930s, with the early 1930s, with Stegemann.
Well, let's see. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we finish up?
No, it's just been a pleasure talking to you. I hope this has been of some interest, and I'm very grateful to Crime Wave Press for printing this novel. As you know, one writes, one sends things out, they come back with rejections. Crime Wave took this on, and they published it. And I hope our talk today, although that's not the only point, I hope our talk today makes people go out and buy the German Messenger in very large numbers. I think people might find it interesting.
Well, I'm finding it interesting, and I recommend it. So, is there anything else? Is there any advice that you would offer to people who want to write novels or write for a living?
Oh, well, I don't write. I don't write for a living. I have the day job, and maybe my advice might be, if you really want to write and you really think you're good, you might want to make that your day job. But that requires a great deal of conviction and certitude, and courage, and I'm afraid I don't have that. I need to make the money to pay the bills doing something else. I'm not going to gamble. But the other thing I always say, and I say this to students a great deal, is writers write. If you don't write,
Exactly.
you're not a writer. And I know, I mean, because I can check on my files when I last was working on the Stegeman book, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it's depressing. But I've been working in the meantime. I've been making money in the meantime. What am I supposed to do? So yes, if you're really convinced, you might want to make writing your day job, but you might want to make sure your partner agrees with that. And second, write is right. If you're not writing, you're not a writer.
That's right. Yeah. I always say you have to make the time one way or the other.
Absolutely. Although, I'm sure you would acknowledge that's harder than it's that.
It's hard, but it can be done.
Absolutely.
It's very hard, but can be done if you're devoted to it.
Yes.
But
I almost never regret having spent time. Okay, I'm going to say I never regret having spent time working on a novel.
Yes, I know the feeling.
No matter how tired I am, I never regret it.
I know how you feel. It's like you feel like if you don't write, it just feels wrong somehow.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, with that, I'll just say thank you so much for being here, David, and I appreciate your being on. I've had a wonderful time talking to you. And everybody, I will just add that the Crime Cafe has 2 publications for sale from all retailers online. And you can get copies also as perks if you support the Patreon campaign that we have. You can find that on my website, debbimack.com, DEBBIMACK.com. Thanks again to David for being here. And thank you to everyone who's listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please review us on iTunes. We'd appreciate that very much. In the meantime, happy reading, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.